International Affairs. Professor Fernandez received both the MA and PhD in Sociology from Stanford University. He now teaches courses and conducts research on various topics pertaining to culture, education, and immigration. Professor Fernandez has helped start 5 schools, including San Miguel High School, which serves students from working class backgrounds. Professor Fernandez has also published approximately 50 articles and book chapters on these topics, and he has composed about as many corridos, which are Mexican ballads. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Fernandez.
Good afternoon. I'm not going to say much about my U of A career this afternoon. Let me just say that some of you know that I'm retiring in June after 39 years. It's been a great time, and when I retire, I'll miss the students most. Well, I'll miss most of the students. So what are we going to do this afternoon? Basically 4 things. And I apologize we don't have a remote set. I'm going to share a few stories. I'm going to share a few of the lessons I've learned along the way. Not many. I'm also going to weave in some findings from happiness research. And hopefully we'll have some fun in the process. Now we're going to do this all in about 30 minutes. What is the central idea of the American dream? Incidentally, Randy Pouch's talk was titled, Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams. Now, my childhood dream was not the American dream, okay? But in the process of coming to the United States, you'll see how, in fact, it became part of my dream. So what is the essence of the American dream? Basically, the idea that through hard work, we can move up. We can become basically middle class. The idea that life should be richer, fuller, and better for everyone, regardless of social class, life circumstances. That is, through hard work, we can move up. Now, here's some photographs of my early years in central Mexico. I was born in this town, San Fernandez, Michoacan. The house on the left, bottom left there is my parents' home, where I grew up. Adobe walls. At that time, we didn't have any electricity, running hot water, no stove, no refrigerator, dirt floors. Incidentally, this is the house here in the center. Now, all stucco, tile floors inside. The door that you see in the middle is now metal and glass. That door that you can barely see here, this is a door, now has become a window, metal and glass. Our streets are cobblestone, like the center photograph here, that you see. When I was growing up, and then this photograph, this black and white photograph, my grandfather's corral, where every morning I'd get up, go out the front door, and literally the next door over was his corral, and I drank milk from this cow or one like it. Directly from the cow. That wagon in the background is not decorative. My grandfather used that to haul things to and from the fields, including the corn that when they were harvested. I remember riding in the back and remember harvesting corn, dumping baskets of corn. Now, what are some of the early lessons, former lessons that I learned there? One was that family matters. It matters a great deal. It's much more than the nuclear family. An extended family includes sometimes individuals who are not blood relatives at all. Also, the relationship matter. The idea that we're in this together. It's not simply about me. And also, compassion. Because the idea to be kind. It doesn't cost us anything to make life a little better for someone else. Something as simple as saying hello, something as simple as letting a driver into the road when they're trying to get in. You've had that experience, and so on. On the left here, my wife and 2 of our grandsons. My daughter's here, one of our grandsons here. On the right, my son with his family, the little guy in the middle. is Celestino the fourth. Yes, there were four. And isn't it, the research on happiness says that the single most important predictor of happiness is strong social bonds. Another lesson that I learned. No one should die of poverty. My grandparents were poor. We were all poor. But they always found food when someone was in need. My paternal grandfather lived to be 104. At that age, he was still giving food to people in need. There's a photograph of my mother. She's 93. This is Cincinnati, her picture in Michoacan. Now has a gas stove, tile floors, all the modern conveniences. She still gives food to people in need. One of my grandsons cooks or makes sandwiches for the home. Research says serving others make us happy. In fact, this is one of the top 3 predictors of happiness. This perhaps is the most important slide this afternoon. On the left is my paternal grandfather holding me, and I know what you're thinking, oh, how cute. And on your right is my father. My paternal grandfather died in his early 50s. I was 3 years old, and I can still remember. My father died last year. He was 93. And this is the lesson that death matters. And it should matter because it ought to focus us on living. Life is really, really precious and very short. It hangs by a thread. Well, the question is, how are we spending our time? If it's so precious, it's all we have, and we don't know how much, how is it that we're spending our time? And secondly, who is going to decide for you how to spend your time? You going to let institutions do it? Institutions will tell you how to spend your time and your money. Or are you going to take responsibility and make some decisions for how it is to spend that precious time? But it's not simply about staying busy. As Thoreau reminded us, the ends are busy. It's what we're busy about. Now here, crossing the border, we came from a very, quote, undeveloped country to the most developed country in the world. This was 1957. I was between 8 and 9 years old. And I can still remember the experience vividly crossing at Nogales, Humboldt Nogales, which are called today. I can tell you a story about my encounter with our first hamburger. I'm a vegetarian now. Well, the shock, I always joke that the culture shock was, the reason I became a sociologist was because of the culture shock that I experienced that day crossing the border. Everything that I knew, everything that my mother and my sisters knew, was radically different. The food, the language, the homes, the building, the roads. We moved from this town of something that less than 1,000 people to Santa Rosa, California. At that time, about 40,000 people, and we lived a few blocks from downtown. But my commitment, or my career, has been as an applied sociologist. That is that, yes, theory matters, and we can do a lot of research, but for me it was about application and doing something. I'll share with you a little bit some of the things that I've done. And Warren Buffett says, someone is sitting in the shade today because some time ago somebody planted a tree. And I want to be one of the ones that planted the tree. So what did we do in Santa Rosa, California in my early years? Basically 2 things. Went to school. They put me in 2nd grade. I had already started school in my hometown with Mrs. Albright. Mrs. Albrecht was a very kind, loving woman. We really didn't speak till after that whole year. I have a report card that my parents say, and it said, "I don't think he can speak. I've never heard him say a word." Who was I going to speak to? She didn't understand a single word of Spanish, and I didn't know a single word of English. Incidentally, Roseland Elementary School, we were the only Latino family at the time. Today it is over 90% Latino. But that teacher, we stayed in touch till she died, because she was proud of my accomplishments. But incidentally, I learned how to spell without knowing what was going on. See, in Spanish, we don't have spelling lessons, because it's phonetic. But the teacher would put, Monday morning, some words on the corner of the blackboard, and on Friday she'd erase them. And then there was a spelling test. Now, I figured all this out without knowing what was going on, except just watching over and over. And I just memorized the words, phonetically. And then on Friday, which I got A's in spelling without knowing what the words were, how to pronounce them. The other thing that we did is work. I have had a paying job since I was 9 years old. When we moved to the United States, this is my father picking apples on the apple orchards where we worked. Those apples were packed and went to the grocery store. My mother, my sisters, and I picked the apples off the ground. Those went to the cannery for apple products, apple juice, applesauce, and so on. In the summers, we worked 10 hours a day, at least 10 hours a day. Monday through Saturday, we rested on Sunday. And during the academic year, I'd get home, change, and walk over to the orchard. In the winter, the men would prune the trees. My job was to pick up the brush. I got accustomed to getting up very early to do my homework because I was so tired at the end of the day. Today, I get up at 4 in the morning. Usually work for an hour, and then Jim and I go running and go play basketball. Then all the other schools that I attended, this was in those days it was Cook Junior High, now it's middle school. By this time we were tracked. And I was in the academic track, and academic intermediate remedial. And from there I went to Santa Rosa High School, and it was my English teacher in senior year, right in this classroom, second story right there, that said, "You ought to go to college." And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what that is." Said, "Come after class, after school one day, and I'll explain." I did, and she did, and I said, "We don't have any money. We can't afford it." And she said, "There's financial aid, there's scholarships, and I'll help you fill out the applications." And she did. And I got accepted to a number of four-year schools, but stayed in Santa Rosa and went to Santa Rosa Junior College. It's still called a junior college. Evidently, I gave the commencement speech there 2 years ago, only the second individual to be invited to give the commencement speech at Santa Rosa Junior College. Ann Neal, incidentally, in Santa Rosa Junior College, there's a woman named Ann Neal. And I started out in majoring in architecture, and I had to take gen ed classes. And I took a sociology class with Ann Neal, and then I changed majors. Ann is still teaching to Santa Rosa Junior College, but that's when I started my sociology. It's no mistake. I took about 50 units of sociology, and Jerry Mandel, professor there, took 3 of us to Stanford one day because we were reading a book that a professor authored, a law professor at Stanford, and 3 of us were reading this book and asking all these questions, and one day he said, "If you guys would just shut up, I'll take you to meet the professor who wrote the book." And he did. It probably couldn't be done today. I mean, we jumped in his car and we went there and so on. And I did eventually go there to do my master's and doctorate. Now, some people, when I say that I completed my master's and doctorate in 3 years, they think that it's because I'm super smart. Maybe there's a little bit of that. I was driven. I was focused. And there was also a class clash. Talked about the culture shock at the beginning. I was still poor. And Stanford is a very, very wealthy university. But I didn't want to leave without my degree. So yes, I worked hard in 3 years, and I have 3 publications, and then came to the University of Arizona. Well, some of the lessons that I learned in the U, not necessarily all positive, and that one is that family matters a little bit less. And it's more of a focus on the nuclear family as opposed to the extended family. But the relationships matter a little bit less. There's a lot more focus on the individual, the me. We see the selfie comes out of that, for example. Selfie comes out of that notion. And what's surprising to me is with all this focus on the self, how we still, so many people are uncomfortable in their own skin. They don't like themselves. It's very sad. Well, maybe it's not just the meow generation. Okay, so some of the other lessons learned is that poor people in the United States are stigmatized simply for the fact of being poor. That people live and die in poverty. In 2013, UNICEF conducted a study in child well-being, wealthiest nations in the world, the U.S. Basically, 1 in 3 of our kids lives in poverty. The wealthiest nation, the most powerful nation in the world, poverty rate. Last year, the poverty level was set at $23,850 for a family of 4. Do you think that a family of 4 can live on $23,850 a year? I don't. Half, except 52%, of frontline full-time workers in fast food organizations end up on public assistance. Why? Because you can't make a living on minimum wage. Not a fair wage. Judge Judy earns $47 million a year. Now that's a fair wage. But the situation is that nothing has changed for a long time. Between 1960 and 1970, whether we're talking about the deep poverty, the line at the bottom, or the blue line, low income, between 1960 and 70, tremendous decrease in the number of kids living in poverty. Nothing changed except we see some growth here, actually some increase with the recession. Recommend Robert Putnam's new book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 groups, top, bottom, and middle grade 20% areas. They asked people how they thought the wealth of this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. The notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed and unfair. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any income. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing.
There's a very short clip here.
People are talking about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everything else. But most of the focus seems to be on the United States. And it strikes me that the same story has been told about global inequality too. So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the US. It turns out that this now, let's show how much each of them actually has. Shocking. There was the equal left, which is equal on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing to push to educate their children, nothing to push to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our total wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% accumulated. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to build a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. You can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer.
And the American dream, well, in 2007, basically the family's median net worth in the United States was roughly $126,000. By 2010, it was down to $77,000. That's not social mobility, that's sliding. Remember the American dream, where's it headed? That's what we're seeing today. Arizona now ranks 41st in per capita income, down from 32nd in 2007. Things are not headed up. I had a student that came to my office last year. We were talking, and he was pretty upset. He was pretty upset because his father lost his job and they were losing their home. Middle class. This isn't working poor. Worldwide, millions of people live on less than $2 a day. Now, people say, well, the context, you can't live in New York City for $2 a day, but I'll tell you, you can't live in Santana, Michoacan for $2 a day. There's not many places where one can live for $2 a day. Another lesson that I learned is education matters greatly. In fact, Thomas Jefferson believed that the American education was going to be the great equalizer. As recent as a week or so ago, President Obama talked about higher education as the surest ticket to the middle class. And indeed, that's the case. I know we don't have to look at the numbers, all I want you to look at the pattern. On the right-hand side, the more education, the higher level of income. On the left-hand side, the red, the more education, the lower the unemployment rate. Education does matter, and it certainly has mattered in my lifetime. Had we remained in Santa Ynez, I'd probably have a 6th grade education. That's as far as the school went, and no one generally went beyond that unless you were going to be a priest or a nun. And I was not. So college completion, what's happened in terms of college completion? Well, it's increased for the wealthy. It's no change for the poor, basically. And we've shifted, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a great shift in the United States in how we perceive or how education is perceived. It used to be that education was a public good, and for the benefit of all. That an educated citizenry would be best for the nation. And now, more and more, it's being viewed as a private good, meaning that students, that people are required to pay more for it, and the states are pulling away from it. Since 2007, the state of Arizona's contribution to the university's budget has basically been cut in half. Your tuition has doubled in that time period. Coincidence? I think not. You divide the population into four quarters, right? And then at the bottom and the top. Completion rate, college completion rate for the highest group had gone from 55% to 95%. For the bottom two groups, stable, nothing. That is, this is not the means anymore, at least for that category, great percentage of the population. The avenue, the ticket to the American dream, as it certainly was for me. This one I got to read because I don't always cut the university's budget, but when I do it, I'm going to private. Some of the lessons learned. Well, ideas alone are not going to solve poverty. We've got plenty of ideas, folks. Technology is not going to solve. In fact, doing something about it will. The quote from Stanford Magazine, just this latest issue, around Silicon Valley, ideas are dime a dozen. The value is in the execution. The question is, do we have the will? I mentioned that I'm a public sociologist, and that means that I like to do, I want to do things, and I've been involved with the starting of 5 schools, most of them to serve underserved population. I'm going to share just briefly a little bit about this school. San Miguel High School is located south side of Tucson, in an area where over 50% of the population has not completed high school. San Miguel only accepts students from poor and working class backgrounds. Why? Because other students have other opportunities and other options. These students don't. We're about to celebrate our 10th anniversary. On April 11th, there's a large event, and if anybody wants to buy a ticket, I think Nicola will still have the fear, right? But if we net 100,000, we will pay off the mortgage. We'll be able to retire the mortgage. Now, all these students, in fact, 100% of the students that have graduated from this school have been college eligible. Many of these students would not have graduated from high school, let alone be college eligible. 98% of the students have graduated, that is, the persistence of graduation rate is 98%. 80% are persisting in college, and the school has over 100 partners in the community, including the University of Arizona, where the students work. Because when we designed the school, the idea is, how do you develop a sustainable financial model that will always be able to serve students from poor and working class backgrounds? And what we hit on is a school in Chicago called Cristo Rey, where students work to help offset their tuition. They work in real jobs. Share a job situation, 4 students share a job. And roughly at 400 students at full growth, which we are now, we have a waiting list of students, at full growth, roughly 70% of the operating funds will cover the expenses, the operating expenses of the university, of the school, and we can raise the other 30%. So this school is okay. So what will solve poverty? Well, I think compassion and action. In fact, the combination of that is that we've got to have some compassionate action. You can't sit around and talk about it. We've got to do something, and the question I asked before is, do we have the will to do so? And this is a quote from Bill and Melinda Gates when they gave the commencement speech last year at Stanford University. And this is what they said. Hey, the science doesn't matter if we don't have the empathy, because we're not solving problems, and this is particularly true, I think, for social problems. So some takeaways this afternoon. Life is precious and really, really short, so the question is, how are we spending our time? Family and friends, relationships matter a great deal, and what are we doing to build strong social bonds? Doing something meaningful in life matters. In fact, this is the third most important thing that people mention when they're on research on happiness. And happiness, remember that happiness is a journey. Be grateful and enjoy it every day. And life is a marathon. It is not a sprint. This is me finishing the Mount Lemmon Marathon. Yes, we started at the bottom and went to the top. And and I came in first in my age group, and no, I wasn't the only one in my age group. And most of all, remember to smile and laugh. It's really, really healthy. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much.